The morning she died broke like any other, but the air seemed heavier, as if it carried a secret it could not bear to keep. Outside, August light fell softly over the quiet Connecticut suburb, washing the trees in pale gold. Somewhere within the walls of her home, Hayley McNeff, bodybuilder, champion, radiant figure of strength, lay still. The glow of dawn no longer reflected in her breath. Her neighbors remembered seeing her car in the driveway, the curtains drawn. The house was silent, almost too silent, as though sound itself had been pushed away. A friend who had texted the night before received no reply. In those simple absences, a message unread, a voice unheard, the day began to gather its unease. Hayley had lived in contrast. To the world, she was the image of vitality. Muscles sculpted with precision. The stage lights of competitions casting her in statuesque perfection. Photographs from her peak showed a body in motion, sinews alive with power, eyes burning with the certainty of someone who had mastered herself. Yet in that same body, beneath the skin and discipline, fragile systems ticked like unseen clocks. No one can command those inner hours forever. That morning, the clocks kept their time without her. It was her mother who first felt the weight of absence most sharply. A call unanswered. The second ring prolonged, then fading into voicemail. Silence expanding in the space where a voice should be. The kind of silence that makes one's hands tremble before dialing again. By the time her family entered the house, the stillness inside was undeniable. There was no violence, no sign of struggle. Just a woman, 37 years old, who had gone to bed one night and failed to wake with the sun. The body that had carried her to trophies and applause had carried her into death with the same quiet finality. In the living room, a pair of her shoes rested neatly by the door, running shoes, their laces tied and ready, as if they had expected to be used again. That detail would haunt those who loved her. How life can end not with drama, but with unfinished intention. Shoes waiting, silent witnesses to a morning never lived. Friends remembered her laughter, the kind that filled a gym with warmth even as she pushed through grueling repetitions. Others recalled her stubborn resilience, her insistence on discipline, her faith in progress. And yet, as the news spread, the collective memory began to fracture. To some, she was the picture of perfect health. To others, she carried unspoken fatigue. In death, contradictions rose like shadows. The announcement came swiftly, written in sparse words. Hayley McNeff had passed unexpectedly, but peacefully. Peacefully. The word was meant to soothe, but it unsettled. How could a woman in the prime of her strength vanish so quietly? What unseen current had dragged her from the shore of life without leaving a trace of struggle? That morning's sunrise became a symbol, the light rising indifferent to the absence it illuminated. A star burning as it always had. A neighborhood waking, cars passing, children leaving for school. And within a single home, time stopped. It is here that the story begins, in the stillness after the last sunrise Hayley ever saw. A stillness filled not with answers, but with a whispering question. How does a life so defined by strength slip away with such fragile silence? Before there was mystery, there was motion. Hayley McNeff had carved herself from the raw material of youth, shaping her frame not just with iron weights, but with resolve. In the dim light of gyms, where the air always seemed to smell faintly of rubber mats and chalk dust, she learned the language of repetition: lift, strain, breathe again. Each movement became a line in the story of her body, a body that would one day gleam under stage lights, poised and unyielding. Her journey into bodybuilding was not born of vanity alone. Friends recalled how she was captivated early by the idea of transformation, that the human body could be both fragile and fierce, a contradiction to be mastered. She was fascinated with control, one coach once observed. Not control over others, but over herself. Every rep, every measured calorie, it was her way of wrestling chaos into order. In 2009, Hayley stood beneath the bright banners of the East Coast Classic, the music pounding through the auditorium, and she took first place. Photographs from that evening show her smiling wide, the sheen of competition tan glistening under the lights, a gold medal catching the camera's gaze. For a brief moment, she was not just a competitor, but a champion. Her name called out, her triumph witnessed. That medal would later hang in her home, polished but slightly tilted on its hook, like a reminder that glory always leans toward the past. Yet strength was never only muscle deep. The discipline that shaped her physique also shaped her life outside the gym. She became known not merely as an athlete, but as a voice, an influencer, though she would never have used the word. On social media, she shared tips, encouragement, little bursts of optimism paired with the glint of sweat from her morning sessions. Thousands followed her for the sense that she embodied endurance itself. But there were shadows. Those close to her noticed that behind the brightness of her public smile, fatigue sometimes flickered in her eyes. Competitions demanded more than performance. They demanded a careful dance with extremes diet stripped to the bone, training schedules that pressed against the edges of exhaustion, the ceaseless chase of perfection. It is the paradox of such sports. The stronger one appears on stage, the more fragile one may feel in the quiet hours alone. One motif lingered in her life: mirrors. Gyms are lined with them, not for vanity, but for correction the body reflected back, each angle scrutinized. Hayley spent countless hours staring into those mirrors, adjusting posture, tightening her form, watching herself not as a whole but in pieces. Shoulders, back, quads, glutes, always seeking, never entirely satisfied. She wanted symmetry, a fellow competitor once said. She wanted balance in every line of her body, yet the mirror can be both teacher and tormentor, revealing flaws invisible to anyone else. There was also the clock. Her days were measured by time more than most. The hours of sleep she allowed, the minutes between meals, the precise rest between sets. Life became a metronome, each tick a reminder that discipline ruled. But clocks cannot account for the hidden pulse beneath the wear on the heart, the quiet strain on organs, the unseen cost of endless drive. Philosophers have long remarked that to build the body is to confront mortality, each flex a denial, each contest a rebellion against the inevitable decline. In her pursuit of strength, Hayley seemed to fight not just the weakness of muscle, but the fragility of life itself. Perhaps that was her truest stage, a woman standing defiantly against the shadow of impermanence, daring it to wait a little longer. In the years after her victory, she no longer competed at the same level, but she remained an icon within her circle. She coached, she inspired, she became a figure of endurance to those who struggled with their own battles. To outsiders, she appeared invincible, yet those closest could sense a subtle tremor beneath the armor. And so, when the news broke that she had died at just 37, the shock was magnified by the image she had left behind. The champion, the healthy body, the beacon of discipline. How could such strength falter? What hidden fracture lay beneath the sculpted surface? Her life, once so carefully constructed, now appeared less like an unbroken statue and more like shattered marble fragments of strength, fragments of vulnerability, and in between, a silence no one could easily explain. The house where Hayley McNeff spent her final night was unremarkable to the passing eye, a neat suburban dwelling with pale siding and a tidy lawn. Yet after her death, the air inside took on a strange weight, as though the walls themselves remembered. The stillness of the rooms became louder than any sound, echoing with questions that had no answer. Friends and family drifted through the house in those first days, each pausing at small objects as if they might reveal something hidden. A coffee mug, half rinsed in the sink, a sweater draped over the arm of a chair. On her nightstand, a phone with its screen dark, filled with unanswered notifications. The ordinary had become uncanny, every detail carrying the sharp edge of unfinished life. Her last hours were a tapestry woven with contradictions. A message sent to a friend the previous evening spoke of plans for the weekend, a cheerful tone, an invitation to train together. Yet another friend recalled Hayley mentioning fatigue, a heaviness she couldn't quite shake. Between those two moments lies a silence impossible to measure. The motif of silence returned again and again. The phone that did not buzz, the shoes that waited by the door. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed muffled when her sister walked into the kitchen. It was like the house was holding its breath, she later said, her voice trembling. Investigators found no evidence of foul play. The doors were locked, the windows intact, nothing disturbed, no signs of chaos. Just a body at rest, as if sleep had taken her too deeply. To outsiders, the lack of violence might have been reassuring. But to her family, it was worse. An invisible hand had taken her, leaving nothing behind to blame. There were whispers of health complications, of stress accumulated through years of training, of substances that bodybuilders sometimes use but rarely admit. No conclusions, only suspicions, drifting like dust motes in the air. Each theory both comforted and tormented her loved ones. Comforted because an explanation is easier than none. Tormented because without proof, every explanation felt like a betrayal of her memory. The room where she died became a point of pilgrimage. Her mother, unable to bear the silence, placed a candle on the dresser. Each night it was lit, casting a trembling glow across the walls, shadows bending like restless figures. The candle became a quiet ritual, a way of speaking into the silence. We see you. We have not forgotten. Psychologists sometimes note that the human mind abhors a vacuum of cause. When confronted with an unexplained death, memory itself becomes suspect. Every gesture in the weeks before is reinterpreted, every phrase dissected. A yawn becomes a symptom, a sigh, a signal, a moment of distraction, a warning. Hayley's friends found themselves replaying old conversations, listening for meanings that were never there. This is the cruelty of sudden death. It rewrites the past as much as it ends the future. Her trophies and medals were gathered into one room after the funeral, displayed together like relics. But even they seemed muted. Their metallic gleam dulled under the weight of absence. A family member described standing in that room at dusk, watching the fading light catch the edges of a gold medal. For a brief moment, it looked like the sun itself had cracked into pieces and scattered across her accomplishments. And then, just as quickly, the light was gone, leaving only the objects and the quiet they could not fill. The unquiet room was not confined to the house. It spread outward into the gym where her absence left a gap, into the community that followed her, training updates, into the lives of those who had drawn inspiration from her discipline. Everywhere she had been, there was now a pause, a gap in the rhythm, and so the silence became her last companion, echoing across spaces where once there had been laughter and motion. The world moved on, as it always does. But in the places she had touched, time seemed momentarily suspended, as if waiting for her to return and finish what had been left undone. When the body leaves a home, it enters a different world, one stripped of warmth, reduced to measurements and reports. For Hayley McNeff, the transition from daughter, sister, champion to case file was both abrupt and chilling. At the coroner's office, her life was condensed into columns of data: height, weight, age, time of death. Beneath the fluorescent lights, the radiance that had once captured audiences was replaced by clinical detachment. Autopsies are supposed to resolve mysteries, to turn silence into certainty. Yet in Hayley's case, the findings whispered more than they declared. Early notes mentioned no obvious trauma, no wounds, no clear pathology that could explain a sudden ending. Toxicology screens were ordered, their results weeks away, leaving a purgatory of speculation. The investigators wrote pending, a word that can feel heavier than any diagnosis. Her family waited, restless. Friends exchanged messages filled with theories. Perhaps an undetected heart condition. Perhaps exhaustion from years of relentless training. Perhaps the invisible toll of supplements and enhancers whispered about in bodybuilding circles. None of these explanations felt conclusive. They floated, fragile, like smoke rings that vanished before they could be grasped. The language of medical reports is cold by necessity. No evidence of external injury. Cause undetermined. To the grieving, such phrases can feel like denials. How could a body so strong give no clue, no warning, no betrayal in its final hour? For her mother, each sterile phrase became an accusation, as if the silence of the report suggested there was nothing to mourn, nothing to explain. But grief demands more than blanks. It was in this limbo that shadows gathered. The autopsy, instead of clarifying, became a mirror of the uncertainty already haunting her death. The more the report withheld, the more her absence seemed uncanny. In mythology, oracles speak in riddles. In science, riddles arrive disguised as inconclusive findings. Both leave those who seek answers pacing in circles, desperate for resolution. The motif of time reappeared here. Clocks ticked in waiting rooms as her family sat in silence, each second stretching into eternity. They imagined the examiners leaning over her, the still body laid out beneath surgical lamps, instruments tracing paths across her skin. Somewhere in that sterile theater, they hoped, would emerge a sentence that explained everything. But time passed, and still the answers did not come. Philosophers write that human beings cannot tolerate randomness in death. We weave meaning even where there is none, because to accept chance is to accept chaos. In Hayley's story, the absence of cause was unbearable. Her life had been built on control, on discipline, on the belief that effort could master outcome. To lose her in silence was to face the possibility that no amount of control could ever secure tomorrow. The autopsy's shadow extended beyond the lab. Online communities speculated, blending admiration with suspicion. To some, she was a victim of a culture that demanded perfection at any cost. To others, she was proof that even the strongest fall to unseen weaknesses. Her image, once an emblem of vitality, became a canvas for debates she could no longer answer. Weeks later, when toxicology results trickled in, they did little to resolve the matter. Substances were noted, but none in lethal amounts. Stressors were identified, but none singular enough to be blamed. Her death remained listed as unexpected. Officially, it was a puzzle without a key. In the end, the autopsy did what many rituals of inquiry do. It illuminated the outlines of absence without filling it. The report closed, filed, archived, while her family remained suspended in uncertainty. For them, the science was not enough. For them, every unanswered line was a shadow cast over memory, a reminder that some truths refused to be named. And so, even as her body was released for burial, the mystery remained unburied. The shadows of the autopsy lingered, stretching long across her story. A darkness, not of violence, but of absence. The kind of darkness that grows deeper the more one stares into it. In the days that followed, the story of Hayley McNeff began to dissolve into two currents: the public memory and the private grief. Online, tributes cascaded like waves, each post trying to hold her in words. A warrior, an inspiration, a bright soul taken too soon. Photographs were shared endlessly, her smile beneath competition lights, her arms lifted in triumph, her presence glowing with confidence. To her community, she became a symbol. One more star, extinguished, yet still visible in the night sky of collective memory. Privately, the atmosphere was heavier. Her family moved through her home, as if through a museum of echoes. The medals remained on their hooks, the shoes still by the door, the candle lit each night in her unquiet room. They spoke of her in the present tense at first, the tongue refusing to acknowledge the shift. She loves that song. She always makes that face. Grief, in its early days, often insists that the person is merely out of sight, not gone. The paradox grew sharper with time. Publicly, she was enshrined in strength. Privately, she was remembered in fragility. Her laughter at a family dinner, the way she once sat silently by a window watching a storm roll in, the sudden tears she quickly brushed away. These fragments layered together to form a portrait not of contradiction, but of humanity strong and soft, invincible and vulnerable, all at once. Her funeral drew those she had trained with, those she had coached, those she had inspired without ever meeting. The room was filled with bodies shaped by iron and sweat, yet bent in sorrow. A pastor spoke of endurance, of running the race, of finishing strong. But the congregation's eyes were fixed on the casket. White roses laid atop it like snow, and the silence said what words could not. No one knew why the race had ended here, so soon, so abruptly. In the months after, theories did not fade. They multiplied. Some insisted her heart had simply given out, overtaxed after years of relentless strain. Others whispered about hidden struggles, about choices made in private that clashed with her public image of discipline. Still others suggested that life is sometimes neither fair nor logical, that it simply ends without reason. It is in that uncertainty that her story continues to haunt. A candle burning in an empty room, shoes waiting at the door, a clock ticking with no one to hear it. These symbols endure because they refuse closure. They remind us that life's sudden vanishings leave traces, objects frozen in expectation, moments left unfinished. Philosophers speak of the fragility of goodness, the idea that no matter how carefully one builds a life, it remains vulnerable to forces beyond control. Hayley embodied both the defiance of that truth and its inevitability. She built herself into an image of strength, yet in death became the embodiment of fragility. It is this paradox that lingers, keeping her story alive not as resolution but as question. Over time, her image may fade from news feeds, her name spoken less frequently in gyms and living rooms. But among those who knew her, and even those who only glimpsed her through screens, the mystery endures. Her death remains less an answer than an invitation to reflect on strength and its limits, on the unseen battles carried in silence, on the way light itself can vanish without warning. And so, her story does not end with the moment her heart stopped. It ends here, in the space between memory and myth, where a woman's life flickers like a candle in the dark, gone, yet still casting shadows.